Have you ever believed something so deeply that it felt like common sense? The kind of truth no one even bothers to challenge anymore. Not because it was proven, but because it was repeated for so long that it hardened into fact. In certain military rooms far away from Southeast Asia, there was one belief that floated casually in conversations, often paired with a smirk. Filipinos are tough on land, sure. They know hardship. They survive storms. But water, rivers, jungle currents, that's not their strength. They can't really swim, not the way elite soldiers should. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It lived in jokes, in half-sentences, in raised eyebrows during joint exercises. The kind of insult that hides behind confidence and calls itself experience. And over time, it began to sound like everyone agreed. As if the whole world had quietly nodded and moved on. Then, one day, during a joint jungle warfare training exercise deep in the tropics, that assumption slipped out loud. An American Green Beret instructor, highly decorated, calm, respected, looked at the river ahead and said it without malice, almost casually. "Filipinos struggle in water. This will be difficult for them." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. When someone like him speaks, people listen. When someone like him assumes, it shapes expectations. The river in front of them was no swimming pool. It was wide, brown, restless, fed by days of rain. The jungle pressed in from both sides, thick and alive, humming with insects and unseen movement. The current didn't roar, but it pulled, quietly and confidently, the way nature does when it knows it doesn't have to prove itself. This was the kind of water that exposes fear, the kind that strips training down to instinct. The Filipino soldiers stood listening. No arguments, no protests, no wounded pride on display. Just stillness. Faces calm, eyes focused. If they felt insulted, they didn't show it. Because for many of them, water was not an obstacle learned in a pool. It was part of life. Rivers crossed to get to school. Floods survived without warning. Boats paddled before bicycles were owned. This was not a drill to them. It was familiar ground. And yet, in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was perception. The belief that they were about to be exposed, that this would confirm what the world already thought it knew, that this jungle river would become proof. What no one said out loud was that moments like this carry more than training objectives. They carry history. They carry pride. They carry generations of being underestimated. And as the signal was given, as boots edged closer to the water, something shifted in the air. Not anger, not defiance. Something quieter. A decision. Because sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is not to argue. It is to move forward, step into the current, and let the results speak. The first step into the river was not dramatic. No shouting, no chest pounding. Just a slow, deliberate movement forward, boots sinking into mud that had swallowed countless footprints before theirs. The water crept up their legs, cold and heavy, pressing against muscle and gear, as if testing resolve. The American observers watched closely now. This was the moment they expected hesitation, a slip, a struggle, something to confirm what they believed. But hesitation never came. The Filipino soldiers moved as if they had been here before, not as guests, not as trainees, but as men who understood the language of water. They didn't fight the current. They read it. They angled their bodies, adjusted their footing, leaned into one another when needed. It wasn't flashy. It was efficient, quiet, almost intimate, like a conversation between man and river. One Green Beret lowered his binoculars slightly, frowning, not in anger, but in confusion. This was not what he had prepared to see. He had trained in rivers across continents, from icy mountain streams to artificial courses built for testing limits. But this was different. There was no wasted energy here, no panic masked as aggression, just control. As they moved deeper, the river began to show its teeth. The bottom dropped unexpectedly, pulling one soldier chest deep in seconds. Gear tugged downward. For a brief moment, the water tried to claim him. Without a word, two others shifted, locked arms, redistributed weight, and kept moving. No commands were shouted. No instructor intervened. It was instinct born from repetition, from childhood memories of floods and ferries, from villages where survival depended on knowing when to push and when to yield. On the bank, the jokes stopped. The jungle seemed to grow quieter, as if even it was watching. Sweat mixed with river water. Faces remained calm, eyes alert, breathing steady. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It had become something else, a demonstration of belonging. The river was not an enemy to conquer. It was terrain to pass through, respected but unfeared. The Americans began exchanging glances. One of them muttered softly, almost to himself, that this looked like second nature. Another nodded slowly, arms crossed tighter than before. Expectations were unraveling, thread by thread. The belief that had felt so solid just minutes earlier now felt fragile, even embarrassing. When the last Filipino soldier stepped onto the opposite bank, boots dripping, shoulders squared, there was no celebration. They simply regrouped, checked one another, adjusted straps, and waited. As if this was nothing special. As if the real work was still ahead. And that was the moment the realization truly began to settle. This was not luck, not adrenaline, not a fluke performance under pressure. This was lived experience. A kind of training no manual teaches, no facility can replicate. The river had spoken, and it had said something no one expected. Something changed after the river, though no one announced it. There was no speech, no correction, no apology spoken out loud. But the air felt different. The Americans no longer stood apart with folded arms and measuring eyes. They stood closer now, watched more carefully, listened more quietly. It was as if a door had opened, not dramatically, but enough to let doubt walk in and certainty slip out. The training pushed deeper into the jungle. Narrow trails swallowed by vines, mud that clung to boots like it didn't want to let go, humidity that pressed against the lungs, making every breath a conscious act. This was supposed to be the equalizer, the phase where fatigue reveals weakness, the phase where technique breaks down and assumptions come rushing back to claim their place. But instead, something unexpected kept happening. The Filipino soldiers moved with a rhythm that felt older than doctrine. When the terrain became confusing, they slowed. Not because they were lost, but because they were listening. When the ground softened, they adjusted spacing without being told. When one man stumbled, another was already there, not reacting, just anticipating. It looked less like a unit following commands, and more like a body responding to its own instincts. One American instructor finally broke the silence, asking quietly how long they had trained like this. The answer was simple. Since they were young, not in uniform, not with rifles, but with floods that came without warning, with rivers that decided when roads no longer mattered, with storms that forced families to move together or not at all. This wasn't bravado. It was stated plainly, almost apologetically. As the hours passed, the score everyone pretended not to be keeping became impossible to ignore. Navigation checkpoints reached faster, formations held longer under stress, decision-making sharpened instead of collapsing. The jungle, which had been framed as a threat, seemed to bend slightly in their favor, as if recognizing something familiar. The American Green Beret who had spoken earlier found himself watching one Filipino sergeant in particular, not because he was loud or dominant, but because others naturally oriented around him. A quiet presence, calm eyes. When he moved, others adjusted without hesitation. Leadership without performance.
Confidence without display. That was when the realization deepened. This was not about swimming, or strength, or endurance. It was about environment shaping character, about a country where hardship does not isolate people but binds them, where survival is communal, not individual, where nature is not conquered but understood, respected, lived with. By the time they reached the next river, no one joked, no one predicted failure. There was only attention, and something else, harder to name. Respect, perhaps, or humility. The jungle had not finished its test. But the story had already begun to turn, quietly, undeniably, in a direction no one had expected.
By the time night settled over the jungle, fatigue had stopped being an enemy and become a companion. Muscles ached. Boots were permanently wet. Every movement carried weight, not just from gear, but from hours of tension that refused to release its grip. This was usually the point where cracks appeared, where patience thinned, where discipline had to be forced. Yet, among the Filipino soldiers, something almost unsettling emerged. Calm. They moved through the darkness without hurry, not because they were slow, but because they trusted one another completely. When visibility dropped to almost nothing, hands reached out instinctively, a brief touch on a shoulder, a quiet signal passed without words. Someone murmured a short prayer under his breath, not loudly, not for show, just enough to steady himself. No one mocked it, no one questioned it. Faith here was not a performance. It was part of breathing. The Americans noticed the smiles first, small ones, fleeting, shared after a difficult climb or a successful maneuver. Not smiles of ease, but of acceptance, as if hardship was not something to complain about, but something to walk through together. One Green Beret later admitted that this was the moment he felt something shift inside him. He had trained with elite units around the world, but he had rarely seen suffering met with quiet joy. At a brief halt, soaked and exhausted, the Filipino sergeant gathered his men close. There was no speech about glory, no reminder about proving anything, just a few soft words about watching each other's backs, about getting everyone through safely. Heads nodded. Someone adjusted another man's strap without being asked. Someone else shared the last of his water. These gestures were simple, almost invisible, but they carried weight heavier than any weapon. When training resumed, the Americans no longer stood as evaluators. They moved alongside, followed their lead through tangled roots and slick ravines, and in that shared struggle, something deeply human surfaced. The realization that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it kneels quietly before moving forward again. Later, one instructor would say, almost shaken, that he had never seen resilience expressed this way. Not aggressive, not defiant, just steady, unbreakable, as if these men had already made peace with adversity long before this jungle ever tested them. The emotional peak did not come with a dramatic victory or a shouted score. It came in a moment of stillness, a pause beneath towering trees where everyone stood catching their breath, listening to the jungle hum around them. In that silence, the unspoken truth became clear. This was not a team trying to prove it belonged. This was a people shaped by hardship, faith, and community, carrying those values effortlessly into everything they did. And for those watching, learning, and quietly rethinking everything they thought they knew, it was impossible not to feel it. Something rare had been witnessed. something humbling.
Something that stayed long after the jungle released them from its grip.
When the training finally ended, there was no scoreboard posted, no formal announcements declaring a winner. And yet, everyone there understood that something irreversible had taken place. The jungle had done what briefings and reputations never could. It had stripped away assumptions and replaced them with truth. The kind you feel in your chest before you can explain it with words. The American Green Beret, who once spoke so casually about Filipinos and water, stood quietly at the edge of the clearing, watching the men pack their gear. His posture was different now, less rigid, more reflective. He later admitted to a fellow instructor that he had been wrong, not just about swimming, but about strength itself.
He said he had seen technical excellence before, but rarely had he witnessed a form of resilience so rooted in humility, faith, and care for others. For the Filipino soldiers, there was no sense of triumph. They did not relive the river crossing or replay moments of quiet dominance. They spoke about getting home safely, about families waiting, about thanking God for strength. To them, this was not a story of proving outsiders wrong. It was simply another day of doing what life had already taught them to do: endure, adapt, protect one another. That contrast lingered long after the jungle faded behind them. In a world that often measures power by volume and intimidation, what unfolded there offered a different lesson. That true capability does not announce itself.
That the most dangerous underdog is the one who does not need validation. The one who has already been tested by storms, floods, loss, and faith, long before any foreign unit arrives to observe. The phrase, "they can't swim," never surfaced again. Not in jokes, not in passing comments. It disappeared quietly, the way false beliefs often do when reality finally confronts them. In its place was something far more enduring: respect. Earned not through dominance, but through consistency, through values carried calmly under pressure. For Filipinos watching this story from afar, especially those who have lived a lifetime being underestimated, there is something deeply affirming here. A reminder that what the world often overlooks is precisely what gives this nation its strength. Community over ego. Faith over fear. Resilience shaped not by comfort, but by necessity. And for those outside the Philippines, this story offers an invitation to look again, to question easy assumptions, to understand that greatness does not always wear the loudest uniform or speak the most confidently in the room. Sometimes it waits quietly at the riverbank, steps into the current without complaint, and lets its actions do the talking. Because in that jungle, far from headlines and speeches, something became clear. The Philippines does not need to shout to be strong. It simply is.